PowerShell Programming with Jeff Wouters.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm serving companies using .NET and Azure. ClearMeasure builds mission-critical software and rescues failing projects, empowering software delivery with a proven approach. Quick announcement, we're in the second year of my architect forums. Signups for the next session are up, and if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, you can just sign up at the link in the show notes. And we've also launched this year a new software leadership forum for technical executives and managers who oversee software engineering groups. So that will focus more on topics specific to management leadership for software engineering departments. So we'd love to have you. And for those who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Jeff Wouters. He was born and raised in the Netherlands and is an IT geek with a passion for automation. At the young age of 6, he had his very first computer and started developing his own Pacman to learn batch programming. And looking back, the performance was terrible, but it worked. Over the years, he's always kept in touch with some sort of scripting or programming languages such as Batch, Turbo Pascal, PHP, Delphi, Kixtart, Visual Basic Scripting, VBS, VB.NET, PowerShell, C#.NET, and he's the owner of Methos, a consulting and managed services company from the Netherlands focused on the Microsoft modern workplace, that's Windows and Intune and Office 365, and also Azure through automation and infrastructure as code. So Jeff, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Our listeners are doing lots of automation for DevOps pipelines and deployments and builds and testing. And so I'm eager to kind of have your background to share. I always like to ask the guests to kind of go back in time. You mentioned doing your first programming at 6 years old, but what were the turning points in your career that kind of led to this focus? In the vast programming and computer world that you could have focused on, are there any turning points where certain things clicked and you really developed a passion for what has kind of defined your career?
Yeah, I think it comes down to 3 points. The first actually was at a certain point at school, I learned how to learn. And it sounds strange, but at least in the Netherlands, in most schools, you don't learn how to learn. You just have to figure it out. And once I had a talk with a teacher, and he sat down with me and he tried to figure out what my way of learning is. So apparently, if I see it, I can understand it and I can do it. The same way how I code. I look code up online. I deduce how it works, and I can repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And if any luck, I can improve it. So that was a big turning point for me. That actually made me go into scripting, I guess programming also, because you can see it, you understand it, etc. And I always had the passion for many things. So VMware, Citrix, SQL, Windows, pretty much if it had a GUI, I was interested. And there was a Microsoft evangelist in those days in the Netherlands. We had 2 of them, Daniel van Soest. He gave me a little tip. Hey Jeff, look into PowerShell. That's new.
Mm-hmm.
You could only download it from a very obscure TechNet website, and it was strange. It only had like 15 commands in there,
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, I can do way more with VB scripting. So I put it on the side and didn't look at it again. Then PowerShell version 2 came along and PowerShell remoting was in there. So from one computer, I could manage 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for me an eye-opener. Later, I became an MVP in PowerShell and I started talking with the people that I looked up to. Apparently, they also were MVPs or working at Microsoft. And I learned a lot from them. And the moment I became an MVP, I was like, I know PowerShell right now. That's okay. I joined the MVP mail list and I was like, feeling a little bit like a very small guy again.
Mm-hmm.
They were throwing code around. I was like, I have no clue what they mean or what it involves. And I believe Lee Holmes, he works from Microsoft. He wrote something like a ping sweep code. It was maybe 3 lines of code, and it had better performance than anything I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me at least 10 minutes to figure out what this code did, how it worked. So that was humbling. That's also good every now and then to feel that. And the last one was one of the last years that I was an MVP where we still had the physical MVP summit. I was inside a .NET Core session. And I only knew .NET about using .NET classes in PowerShell.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have a command for it, but .NET can do it, then use the .NET class. And the .NET Core session was, I can only describe it as illuminating for me.
Mm-hmm.
First, we had an architecture session. Why .NET Core? What was the intention, etc., etc. Then I learned from the PowerShell team that they were basically going in a direction of PowerShell Core. It was called those days. I still think that's a marketing mess up, but
Sure.
PowerShell Core is running on .NET Core, and Windows PowerShell is running on .NET Framework. PowerShell.exe is Windows PowerShell, and PWSH.exe is PowerShell. So PowerShell is not PowerShell, but PowerShell is PowerShell. It is logical when you think about the chronological order of things,
Mm-hmm.
but they ended up with something that's like, wait a second, something went wrong here.
Sure. So for all the developers listening who are .NET developers first, like their world is C#, and they can run some things command line, but their PowerShell usage is no different than the shell batch commands where just execute something and pass them some parameters, and that's the extent of it. But now it's PowerShell because everything's PowerShell. The terminal is replaced and whatnot. What do you mean by PowerShell is .NET now? Can you kind of break down what's the architecture under the covers?
The intention of PowerShell was to give system admins the power of .NET Framework, but in an admin-friendly way. So admins in general are not programmers.
Mm-hmm.
And programmers in general are not admins. So when you respect both sides, and you still want the power of .NET, you have to make it so they can use it in a friendly way. So piping commands, even DOS, even Linux, they have the concept of piping. And with PowerShell, it comes down to the output of the first is the input of the second. Essentially, that's piping.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get processes with the command get process, pipe it to where object, so filtering on object properties, etc. And then, for example, pipe it to stop process. And for .NET developers specifically, I recently followed a course from Milan Jovanovic. He's a European guy, and he's going all out on .NET.
Mm-hmm.
I basically took his lessons, created my own basic .NET microservices template, and whenever I start a new project, I copy that thing. I run a single PowerShell script where I replace the name of the project everywhere. So you can do a simple text replace, But if you don't take capitals, for example, into account, capital lettering, then your Docker file will get messed up. Because if you replace lower letter with capital letter in some scenarios, then your Docker file will stop working. I found that out the hard way, by the way.
Because Linux is case sensitive, but Windows is not case sensitive, so that kind of flows through, doesn't it?
That's also PowerShell. PowerShell itself is not case sensitive.
Okay.
But technologies that you use PowerShell to talk with, they can be case sensitive.
Yeah.
For example, in Azure, you have the storage system. A storage account name needs to be lowercase.
Okay.
Because of the system underneath requires that. And some people, especially in training, when admins go in Azure training or in PowerShell training, they're like, wait a second, PowerShell is case insensitive. I know, but the system underneath, it is.
Right.
And this is where PowerShell can do parameter validation. A script, but also a function, can have parameters. And you can validate that the input is only lowercase. If you want, you can even force it that if you put in capital case, you make it lowercase. And this is a way of ensuring that you end up with the correct information in your code. And then inside your code, you don't have to do all the validation checks, etc., etc. So if you do the validation checks in the parameter section, that saves you a heck of a lot of code.
Sure. So for developers who are automating builds, running tests, deploying, and running commands to spin up Azure, what are the best ways to put PowerShell in place in that environment? And what mistakes do you see people making?
Mistakes, not necessary. Yeah, sometimes. Once you loop, this is the same in any language. But if you loop, and you loop again inside the loop, make sure that you loop on a different set of objects. So, for example, if you have query your Active Directory on groups, and based on those groups, you get the subgroups. And based on the first groups...
You're talking about resource groups inside an Azure subscription?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
Okay.
Now groups in Active Directory.
Oh, Active Directory.
Like user groups.
Okay.
So essentially you have all your groups. Then you from each group, you do the subgroups. And then from your original group, you get the users. I've seen code like that, and that's just bad programming in any language. Then your script will take a heck of a long time to execute. And in .NET Framework, it's nice every now and then to dispose of objects. In PowerShell, 9 out of 10 times you don't need to do that because it will do it for you. That's also something I see in PowerShell. You can dispose just as the same as in .NET Framework. And I see admins doing it the textbook way. And then I see programmers using PowerShell, but basically running .NET code.
Okay.
And this is where an admin can come along and do things in 2, maybe 3 commands, where the developer has a page of code. So I think the most important thing for developers is know which commands are already there, or which commands you can make available just by installing a module.
Well, we'll talk about that, because I think there's a lot of .NET developers who use a little bit of PowerShell that don't know what modules are and how to use them.
For me, easy. Google or Bing. I don't know each module also. There is a command find package where you can look for example, the NuGet.org repository, or in the PowerShell gallery. That will help you if you know at least the name of what you want to do. For example, if you need a module for Trello, then you can find a whole bunch of them, including one of my modules. But if you can't find it that way, try Google. Sometimes there's code out there that is just not yet on a module or inside a module. That's fine. And the same with any other code. Copy paste it from the internet. Understand it before you execute. And then have fun with it. Expand on it. Maybe share with the community again.
So .NET developers are used to pulling in libraries from NuGet.org. You're saying that there's the same thing for PowerShell modules, and there's lots and lots of free open source modules that do all kinds of interesting things. You mentioned Trello, and I guess there's other commercial packages or modules to integrate with commercial services.
Yeah, the beauty, PowerShell is free. So also PowerShell modules are free. But sometimes they need to interact with a web API, and sometimes those need a subscription.
Yeah.
So that's just fine.
Yep.
But I also found out that you have two kinds of modules. Binary modules, those are written in most of the time in C#.NET. And you have modules that are written in PowerShell. So again, I had a certain learning curve at a certain point. I found out that the System Center Operations Manager module was basically written in PowerShell. Not binary modules, but just PowerShell. So I dove in there and I found syntax tricks that I never knew. So every now and then, look into that code and learn and investigate.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So there's every .NET developer has done some type of batch job or back-end process that sits there and listens for messages on a queue and then processes the messages. Just nothing, no UI, just sits in the background and does something. And it's possible to write a C# executable that can take in parameters and process parameters and then use them. But with PowerShell being native .NET, what's your opinion on processing parameters in C# code versus just making your little library in .NET code, but then let PowerShell wrap it and process parameters and then actually call it?
I'm a practical guy. So if developers for a software solution has already written the libraries, etc., why should I ever rewrite the stuff they did? Or so import what they did, use it, and for example, script that way. So if I want to generate test data, for example, sometimes you can use PowerShell to look into an Active Directory, an HR system, and maybe a SQL database. For one customer, we had a Novell directory that was very ancient, but we looked into that one. And we generated test data based on that. And then we used the .NET classes to talk to the product. And that's also a benefit. You immediately test those classes. So from a product owner perspective, once we did our test data seeding, I can always say, hey, this SDK that we are releasing works. So my recommendation was create your test data through that way. Then release your SDK because, heck, we tested it. And then you know that your partners and your customers can use that SDK and it will always work. So then your seeding and your test data becomes part of your release cycle, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of testing, when quite a bit of PowerShell code crops up, what's the available in your preferred methods of actually writing automated tests that can run in a build process?
Depends on what you want to test. If it's like unit testing, integration testing, then I would use something like XUnit, NUnit, whatever framework you prefer.
Mm-hmm.
Executing those tests, you can use a simple line of PowerShell for that. And what we found out is that how do you say that? Yeah. If a developer writes code, then you only want to unit test their code.
Mm-hmm.
So their specific branch maybe. But why would you ever use the cloud resources for that if you can use the laptop of the developer themselves?
Mm-hmm.
So you can use Git hooks for that. So the pre-push, for example. So the developer runs its tests. The developer pushes the code. Then the Git hook comes along with a little bit of PowerShell code.
Mm-hmm.
It runs the test. The developer can continue doing their work. And the results will end up in their screen. You can even write the code so that it emails or whatever you want to do. But we chose to put it in the screen. And only if the code succeeds, then it will push into the cloud, preferably with the results.
That's interesting. So you're using a Git hook so that I, as a developer, when I do git commit and then when I do the push, it's going to run a unit test suite on my computer before it actually pushes up to the team's Git repository.
Because the unit tests are in the repository. They are on your laptop. Everything you need to unit test is there.
Right.
So why would I block my pipeline because you write crappy code?
Yeah, that's a great scenario, especially for teams that are maybe committing directly on the master branch versus feature branches. And it sounds like it's under the covers. I mean, it doesn't block anything on the developer's workstation because it's just running another process.
If it's done correctly, no.
Yeah.
And we found this out because a customer was hitting the point where they kind of needed to buy parallel pipelines in Azure DevOps. And looking at the price, they didn't want to.
Yeah.
So we tried to brainstorm, like, hey, what can we do? And then one of the junior developers actually came with this idea. And we were looking at each other and like, this is simple, stupid, and brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So we tried to do it, and it eventually they had to buy parallel processing, but by then they had a use case for it.
Mm-hmm.
They had a business case.
Yeah. If you're like me, I remember having some interesting ideas when I was a young programmer, and I see young programmers all the time coming there. You can say they're thinking outside the box, but at this point in their career, the box hasn't been constructed fully yet. So they're just thinking.
The same with children. Their mind hasn't been ruined yet.
Right. Have to unlearn some bad habits that's right. Well, what's next for you? What are you currently working on that's kind of capturing your passion and studying more on the side?
Yeah, I've already tried to keep my Microsoft certification up to date. So that's like an exam a month these days.
Mm-hmm.
I also stopped putting it on LinkedIn because recruiters kind of noticed that. And once I stopped doing that, then I get a lot less recruiters. And I like that.
Sure.
That recruitment, that's an annoyance thing for me because, hey, you see, I'm a CTO of a company. I'm the founder.
Yep.
You see, I have employees, and you expect me to leave my job for a sysadmin job? Really?
Sure. Which means that they just didn't read. They're not really reading your profile.
Nah. I'm studying for my SISM. I kind of want to do a little bit more security. And the SISM certification is more into processes. And as an architect, that's kind of useful.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll end up...
For the listeners, just CISM. And what does that stand for?
Certified Information Security Manager.
Okay.
And maybe I'll end up with the CISSP, but that's a monster. And I know quite a few people that tried it and they failed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I want to take my career in that direction. And as a side note, I'm a little bit of an odd duck. I like Azure. I like local stuff. I like modern workplace. Um, but I also like basic sysadmin stuff and scripting and .NET, but also Angular and React.
Yeah.
So one of my side projects I've been working on for years, off and on. It's called Script Portal.
Okay.
And the intention is that early next year we'll do finally a release publicly. And that's going to be a challenge and fun because that will be my first product. We don't know yet if we want to make it commercial or full open source and for free for everybody. We'll figure that out along the way.
Sure. Right. Well, it's one if you can make it commercial with a paid structure and make that work, then that's interesting. Or if you can make it free and have everyone hire your consulting company for more work, well, that's another angle.
Well, there's a German solution out there called Script Runner. And apparently they are doing something similar to what we are building. There are similarities, but I also say it's different. And once they got wind of me creating this, I got a very lengthy conversation with one of the employees, and they basically told me that if you do this, we're going to sue. That scared me a little bit. Also, I had other priorities like building my company.
Right.
And in the meantime, I put a lawyer on that, and he was like, well, as long as you follow certain rules, that shouldn't be a problem. And if we make it commercial, then we'll release it that way. And let's say that, for example, we are at fault, then I can still make it freely available for everybody.
Sure.
So for us, it is an additional service, I guess, we offer, a product. And for us, it's not our bread and butter.
Right.
So, like you mentioned, if we can do this and get extra consultancy hours, awesome.
Right. Exactly. Well, I'm sure it'll work out. Having another company notice you like that means that it probably will be useful.
You must be doing something right.
That's right. They don't want the competition. So
let's hope so.
Well, what's next for you? Any conferences or anything that the listeners that we need to turn them on to?
On Friday, I've got the App Manage event in Utrecht.
Okay.
I've been doing that since, I would say, about 10 years now. So a long time. And over the last few years, I took a little bit of a break of the events. I had a bit of an experience that, I would say that, you could say that it shook me to the core. And that made me take a break. Also evaluate a few things. And about a year ago, I did one session because of a friend of mine asked me, hey, can you fill in? And I loved it so much. I felt the urge again to start speaking. So slowly and steadily, I'm putting in sessions again.
Okay.
But if you took a break for about, I would say, 3 years, then you need to rebuild your reputation again.
Yeah. Well, I know there's a number of, I'm not sure about the European area, but in the US, there's quite a number of user groups that are doing more and more virtual presentations. So there's definitely that opportunity.
I don't like those. As a presenter, I want audience. I want to see people. I want to visually see their reaction. And that's how I thrive. And for example, the Corona days, I did no sessions at all. Yeah. I believe I did one, and then I figured out, okay, this is not my thing.
Yeah, it's totally different. And doing quite a few virtual sessions, presentations myself, there will be maybe a very small handful that keep their camera on so you can see some of the facial expressions, and then the rest of them no camera. So it's more difficult.
And there's one lady in the Netherlands, Barbara Forbes. She's also an MVP. When Corona started, she started doing like 2-3 sessions a day.
Wow.
Because she could do that. And one was in Asia, one was in Spain, one was in North America. I have a high respect for people that can do that.
Sure.
But as I mentioned, that's not for me.
Right. Well, for anyone in your area who would like to request a presentation that's down your alley, how should they request it?
You can either find my name, Jeff Wouters, on pretty much any social media. Not OnlyFans, sorry. And you can send me an email on jeff@methos.nl. And if you ever see me, just ask.
Okay, we'll include those in the show notes so that people can easily find it and
Thanks.
And send you an invite. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. As we close out, is there any go-to resources that you would suggest that our listeners go to if they want to get deeper understanding in PowerShell? You can go to the Microsoft Learn and whatnot, but are there any that stand out that you would also point them to?
Yeah, there's a podcast called the PowerShell Podcast. No surprise there.
Okay.
PowerShell.org. And for me, still Twitter. Yeah, every now and then I follow certain hashtags. And then certain people that have good content in their blogs, they keep popping up. And that's how I essentially get my RSS feeds full. Maybe that's old. Maybe people don't use it anymore, but I do. Sure. I put an RSS feed on blogs that I follow.
Okay. Is that shareable, or any keywords that we can include in the show notes?
Of course, PowerShell, DSC or desired state configuration. M365 DSC, that's basically desired state configuration for the Microsoft Cloud. Azure CLI also does the trick.
Okay.
And these days, next to PowerShell, I also do Bicep.
Yep, BICEP.
Yeah, basically, there's pretty much any automation language that applies to whatever platform that you manage or whatever. You can look for either Terraform, Ansible. That's not Microsoft, of course, but if that floats your boat, hey, do it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the Azure and DevOps podcast and sharing what you've learned and seen in the PowerShell world and beyond. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Awesome. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.